Hey there, welcome back to the Intergenerational Trauma Show. And today we are going to talk about complex trauma in adults and the cycle of intergenerational trauma transmission. So basically, this is week 3 of the 2024 immersion calendar for intergenerational trauma therapists. And I thought I would just kind of show you what that calendar looks like. So here it is. That's the cover page, a welcome. So this is the monthly theme list. There's an introduction to intergenerational trauma. That's where we are right now. So we're just kind of briefly going over various things that are really important to understand when working with intergenerational trauma. Then we get deeper into specialization. We look at the Intergenerational Resilience Method, assessment, diving deeper into complex trauma with adults and developmental trauma in kids and teens. Then we look at complex cases, developing treatment goals, self-care for parents and therapists, because this is really important. Having a compassionate community of professionals, because this can be a really difficult population to work with, and the work can be quite hard and isolating if you don't have that support. And then just gratitude and growth and celebration and closure. So basically every month has an introduction to the content for that month. And then there's daily prompts that you just kind of go through the calendar and think about these things every week. I do a video that kind of summarizes points of these to help kind of guide your awareness and your knowledge in that area. So that is the 2024 Intergenerational Trauma Therapist Immersion Calendar, and it's the whole year long. So we're going to have a great year this year. So the themes for this week are looking at how to identify and distinguish complex trauma from other forms of trauma, key considerations when working with people who have complex trauma, assessment tools and what interventions are most effective, ethical considerations and boundary things that we have to be aware of, and how therapists can enhance and nurture resilience in their clients. So we're going to start off with kind of identifying and distinguishing complex trauma. So complex trauma is very different from single incident trauma in that it's a collection of traumatic experiences that have happened over a period of time. So it may be neglect, abuse, getting taken into foster care. It's all these traumatic experiences that happen one after the other, whereas single incident trauma is like a flood, one episode of some kind of abuse or neglect. And it's more circumscribed to that one experience, where complex trauma, there's multiple things that have happened. So there's a chronic exposure to traumatic experiences that then affects child development. So that's the developmental trauma. And if it's not resolved and addressed as they age, it becomes more of the complex trauma that we see in adults. So when we work with intergenerational trauma, complex trauma is used to refer to the adult impacts of the trauma. And this is from their own experience of developmental trauma. So that's how I kind of distinguish and help the families understand the intergenerational trauma transmission, that developmental trauma is from childhood and develops with chronic exposure to traumatic experiences. If it's unresolved, it can shift into complex trauma that has the adult impacts. So I distinguish between those. A lot of people call it complex developmental trauma, or just use complex trauma, or they just use developmental trauma. I use that distinction so that the parent can kind of tune into that transmission cycle, so that they learn that they had developmental trauma themselves, that they weren't able to develop the skills and the things that they needed to have healthy parenting skills, and now that they have complex trauma, if they resolve it, their child may have less exposure to developmental trauma or none. So that's what we really want to look at. I know exactly who this is. This is Muhammad in Afghanistan. He is one of my most frequent watchers, and I just really enjoy my interactions with him. So hello, Muhammad. I'm glad you're here today. He's doing great work with people in Afghanistan that have been through earthquakes and all of the things that have happened in the country. And he's doing a really good job and really supporting his people very well. Okay. So the key factors that help us identify complex trauma are kind of your basic trauma-related experiences of flashbacks or intrusions, avoidance of things that remind you or trigger those memories, hypervigilance, so being kind of always guarded or watching for things to happen, and then changes in thought and mood, like the world is just not a good place. I won't be as happy as I was before. So those are your common characteristics that you find in trauma, whether it's single incident or complex. But the complex trauma has some specific additions that are found due to the level of the trauma. So you'll find a detachment from people and environmental events. That's kind of that shutdown or kind of a collapsed kind of state where there's just kind of not a lot of life and connection with the world and things around them and the people in their lives. There'll be very excessive emotional dysregulation. So really hot emotions, really upset really quickly, and they're quite intense. And sometimes they will include anger and aggression, especially in relationships, because a lot of complex trauma is relational in nature. And they will also, beyond just changes in thoughts of mood, where the world is no longer a good place, I'll never be happy again, it goes to a much deeper level where it's excessive guilt, shame, sense of failure, sense of not being good enough or worthlessness. And it's a really strong component of complex trauma. And there's sometimes problems forming meaningful relationships because there's that detachment, there's that defensiveness in relationships. It can be really hard for some people with complex trauma to have healthy relationships and be able to connect with other people, which becomes very important in therapy. So when we work with complex trauma, there's some things that we need to understand about the client. And first is understanding things about their background. So complex trauma is highly likely to be relational in nature. So they've had a lot of wounds from people who were important or powerful in their life. And so there's going to be some reactivity in relationships. So when we're working with people with complex trauma, that relationship building and establishing that rapport and the therapeutic relationship, it's a critical intervention in and of itself, so that there's a healthy container for the client to experience things and kind of make those shifts and changes, and to be able to express that anger, that relational agitation or triggering, and have it handled in a different way where it becomes a healing experience rather than another layer of disappointment in a relationship. The other thing that is very, very important to keep in mind is that a lot of people with complex trauma will have a history of, obviously, the relational trauma, as I mentioned, and this may be showing up in relationships with professionals. So teachers, school professionals, doctors, therapists, social workers. So they may have a history of disappointments, distrust, and difficulties in relationships with professionals. So if they're coming in for therapy, this is going to be very difficult for them to just kind of relax and get comfortable. So there's a lot of work that needs to be done to support them in making that transition and developing that trust over time. Another important thing to remember is in Janina Fisher's work, she talks about how going slower with complex trauma is actually going faster. So, a lot of times, if you get a referral and it's complex trauma, but you maybe didn't recognize it as complex trauma and didn't think it would be, you would need to take all these safeguards and precautions before starting therapy, you jump right in and get into therapy and start doing interventions and maybe like EMDR, brain spotting, there can be a huge backlash from that because they probably weren't ready to do it. And some people with complex trauma, you may not even know they have it unless you do a thorough assessment and really kind of look into what's happening, because they're so incredibly resilient that they can look like it's life as usual and there's no difficulties, but when you start hitting those sensitive areas, it'll show up there. So going slower is actually going faster, and not jumping into doing quick processing or really deep interventions is really important as well. So the common challenges that people with complex trauma have is that the relational trauma has been extremely significant in their life. This is probably the main impact that causes complex trauma, is a lot of relational distrust, abuse, all those things that they were supposed to have healthy experiences, but they didn't get. And when that happens, particularly in childhood, survival takes the front seat over anything else. So survival will take priority over developing social skills or over developing coping skills or emotion regulation or being able to read. That survival becomes the most important thing, and it will knock all the development off in these other areas. So you may find that over time, an adult will build some coping skills, they'll do really well, but you'll find little pockets of reactivity where they're really sensitive and need to really have some support for those areas and for healing. The other thing, this degree of trauma is woven into the person's life, and it's woven into most aspects of life. And so they don't know a different way. They may feel like relationships are just really toxic and difficult, and that's what they are. So they just kind of roll along with that, not realizing that they could build different skills and have different relationships. So it's our responsibility to show them a different way, in a way that's also supportive and validating of their experience and the degree of trauma that they have experienced. They can also be, if you're not specialized to the degree that you know what you're working with and you know you can kind of sense it or feel it, and you develop a clinical hypothesis that we might be working with complex trauma here, and I'm going to go slower rather than faster, they can be very challenging or triggering for the therapist or for professionals. So you'll see reports of clients not getting along with therapists or having bad experiences. And to me, it's usually that it wasn't recognized of the significance of the impact. So they went harder and faster, and there was the backlash there. And it can be very triggering for both the client and the therapist. So it's really important to maintain that self-awareness of what is happening in the sessions and kind of what the impact, that felt sense that you're getting, being really attuned to that within yourself. So best practices for working with intergenerational trauma. Number one, as Janina Fisher says, going slow is actually going faster, and that's the most important thing to remember. I like to use neurobiology to normalize their responses, and they'll kind of think that they're because they have no friends or they have no relationships, or the relationships are all really stormy and interpersonally aggressive and those kinds of things, they may feel like there's something wrong with them. But that's a skill that they learned for survival in the past, that it's just no longer useful. So if we can normalize the survival skills that they've developed and support them to develop different skills that can help them have deeper, healthier relationships and get through some of the impacts of that trauma, that's the key for helping and supporting these clients. We also need to be very intentional, very self-attuned, and very attuned to the client, and very transparent with co-regulation. So developmental trauma typically involves difficulties with co-regulation in the parent-child relationship. So some of the adults that we get in therapy that have been impacted by developmental trauma and now have complex trauma, they may have never felt co-regulation where somebody can help calm them down, or somebody can help them feel joy or feel excited about something. They've never had that experience of someone co-regulating them. So this can be used as an intervention. And it needs to be used gently, especially if it's between therapist and client. And this helps improve their self-regulation. My number one co-regulator in therapy is Bjorn, my dog, and he can get through pretty much anybody's defenses, and he's so gentle, and he co-regulates just beautifully, and it's very acceptable for them because he's not a threatening, he's kind of silly and goofy. He sits on people's laps, he does all kinds of little goofy things that helps them feel relaxed and calm. And sometimes that's the first experience an individual will have with co-regulation. So when we look at building trust and rapport, we have to always have that awareness of how is this relational trauma that they've experienced in the past, how is it impacting the therapy relationship? Are they putting up barriers? Are they trying to keep you away because they feel like they're getting close to you, and they may start to kind of depend on that relationship for healing, but it's terrifying for them, so they put kind of blocks up. We have to continually watch for that relational trauma that may interfere or impact therapy. And in any relationship, there are ruptures. There are small things that we do or that someone experiences that kind of pulls them back out of the relationship or causes them to not feel good in the relationship or feel like something wasn't right, or that you kind of did or said something that didn't sit well. And it's very important, even if the rupture is minor and it doesn't seem like anything that would really upset someone, it's really important to attend to that repair, because repair is something that developmentally they probably never got, or got very sparsely in their experience. So they need that experience of relationships can be stressed. We can talk about it, we can work through it, and we can repair it, and the relationship will be stronger as a result. It's also really important to validate and normalize their experiences. So we don't want to encourage them to continue with negative coping skills. That's not what validation and normalization is. It's helping them feel like they're seen and heard, plus helping them know that these are survival adaptations that they needed to do for survival. And we also have to give them support to make progress, to leave those survival skills there, but not as prominent, and develop other skills as well. The other thing, developmental trauma has a lot of implicit aspects. So it's things that people can't like recall and they can't put a finger on it. So it's a feeling, a really deep feeling that they'll have, but there's no explanation for it. So it may be kind of just a sense of total despair, not knowing what caused it, not knowing where it's coming from, but it's just a really strong, real experience. And that can be implicit trauma, and that is going to come up and going to be in the therapy situation. So somebody may become very offended by something that was said, and it may be more of an implicit reminder that they are actually feeling that reaction and experiencing that, but it's related to something in the past, but there's no timeline and they can't distinguish that it was related to something in the past rather than the interaction with the therapist. So it's really important to look for the possibility of implicit memories that can impact therapy. So let's look at assessment tools. So, assessment for me has always been really important and also somewhat complicated because I work with populations that typically aren't included in norms. Sometimes overall Canadians aren't included in norms, or Indigenous people aren't included in norms, and the cultural differences make those tests like they're not valid. So standardized assessments can be kind of tricky to use, but there are some good screening assessments that are in the public domain that have been used for identifying the symptoms and the levels, but they're not like normed against a group of people. So that leaves it open for more clinical interpretation and kind of coming up to your own assessment. So the first one is the SIDES self-report. It's spelled SIDES self-report, and this is by, I hope I pronounce it right, Spinazzola and Bessel van der Kolk, and it's 45 questions related to complex trauma. So it would give you kind of some targets for treatment planning. There's also the ITQ, International Trauma Questionnaire. It's 18 questions, and I think that's been tested internationally. So it may have more validity in a population if you're not in a population that's regularly included in those assessments. Another type of assessment that's important is assessment for dissociation, because dissociation is so common in complex trauma, and it's kind of one of the distinguishing factors that you need to know what level of dissociation is there, and kind of develop some strategies to deal with it both in session and support the client outside of session. I also like to do a clinical history, developmental history and assessment. I like to look at their current stressors. Are they living in a highly violent neighborhood that just has trauma after trauma? Are they having difficulties with experiencing racism? Those are all really important things, but they're also valid things that they may need to avoid or not come in contact with for fear of being incarcerated or having police brutality happen or things like that. So that's not a trauma symptom. That's a survival skill, but it's not avoidance of going out in the community because of trauma. That's a realistic survival skill. So knowing those different things and aspects of their current experience are really important. And I find the clinical assessment in person is it gets around some of the culture, language difficulties, maybe academic limitations where some of the people I work with can't read or write. So handing them an assessment is going to be really difficult for them, and they won't be able to do it, and it's going to cause them to not feel good about themselves. So I'm very sensitive to that in working with the population that I work with. So, how do you choose the right tool based on the client's needs? Well, the first most important thing is looking at culture and language differences. If there's words in there that aren't commonly used in the culture that you're working with, or language differences, it's probably not going to give you an accurate read. Some of the public domain assessments, they're great screeners, but the clinical assessment is also critical to really figuring out what the client is experiencing. Another thing to be very careful of is assessment can be very, very triggering for people with complex trauma because it's basically kind of saying, this is a piece of paper with all your symptoms on it, and let's look at this and see how overwhelmed you get. That's not our intention, but that can really happen because if they mark things very high through the whole assessment and they didn't realize how impacted they were, that can be a real setback for them. So sometimes doing it in a clinical assessment or kind of reviewing it piece by piece instead of doing it all in one shot may be very helpful. Also may be helpful. Some clients can take the assessments if they're assessments that they can take home with them. They do very well doing these. Other clients, you wouldn't want to do that because they could flood and get overwhelmed and not have support there. So in the therapy setting, assessment is for identifying the impacts. We're not making significant decisions court like parental capacity. They can be subpoenaed for court, but they're not being used to make big decisions like that. So we have to keep that in mind. That's the purpose of them. So really the clinical assessments and some of these ones that are in the public domain are really good to use. If you are working with forensics or have the possibility of if you're doing parental capacity, you may include these, but you'll also want to have more standardized and normed assessments as well. They're great screeners for treatment planning. So if you find that someone is avoiding going places and feels like they're very shameful and that they're not a good person, those are things that you can add into a treatment plan at the time when the client is ready to work on that. So that's also where specialized training becomes critical because you may not know the complex picture and how to work all these things together and how to go slower. You may accidentally go too fast and the client experiences a huge setback. Now we're going to look at interventions. So with complex trauma, there has been an emphasis on phase-based approaches. And this comes, I believe, from Judith Herman, who was really a pioneer in the field in, I think it was the 80s. And she has been like a supervisor to some of the greats in our field today, like Janina Fisher, I think, worked under her or had some connection with her. So she's really a pioneer in the field, and she talked about phase-based healing for complex trauma. First phase is safety and stabilization. So we have to get the client to have a sense of safety and have a degree of stability so that they can do deeper work of therapy. The next phase was remembrance and mourning. So kind of looking at the impacts and kind of coming to terms with how deeply impacted a person may have been based on what they experienced. And then reconnection and integration is the third phase, which reconnection with themselves, with other people, with their interests, kind of opening up to life and integrating this history of trauma in with their current life and functioning. So there's a lot of truth to those phases. However, there's a little bit of like controversy or pushback because they're not phases that you complete phase one and you have your safety and stabilization. And now we're going to work on remembering and mourning. And then when that's done, we'll not work on that anymore and we'll work on reintegration and reconnection. So what I find can happen is it's more like layers or kind of a stepwise, like you'll do safety and stabilization, you'll be able to do some remembrance and mourning and integrate that, but then you need to shift back to safety and stabilization. Safety and stabilization needs to be throughout the whole treatment time, and you really need to make sure that that is there, and that becomes kind of the number one intervention. So it's more like a stepwise or pendulating between these phases based on what the client needs at the time. And you may find you'll swing back and forth between these three different phases as they're making progress. So it's not just a straight line. It's kind of like a stepwise or going back and forth, shoring up and integrating some of the skills and then pushing forward again. So it's not a straight line. Some of the interventions that I find really helpful, the first one is psychoeducation. And what this does is it's a top-down intervention, so it uses cognitive skills and understanding. And sometimes if you have somebody that floods really easily, it can inhibit that flooding because it's using a different part of the brain. And it's not like a personalized discussion of their experience with a certain thing. It's learning more about the neurobiology and everything around the trauma so that it helps them develop skills and it helps them learn that their responses are normal for the situation. It also helps normalize their reactions and behaviors. I've had some clients where if you can explain to them why they're experiencing certain things based on neurobiology, they can leave that session. They feel like they're cured. It's not a cure, but they have so much relief from knowing that this isn't something wrong with me, or this isn't something that I've done, or it happens because I'm bad. It happens because the situation. So having that understanding can really create hope for change, and it can start to address some of those negative self-beliefs, the shame, and the worthlessness and all of those, because you're kind of getting to the root of those. One of the resources that I really like to use is Janina Fisher's Transforming the Living Legacy of Trauma. It's a workbook for both therapists and clients. And it's a perfect example of using psychoeducation related to neurobiology to help them start to build some capacity to withstand other interventions in therapy and to feel like they kind of have a sense of what's happening with them and they can move forward. The other intervention that I find extremely useful is polyvagal theory. So if they can understand their autonomic nervous system and those glimmers and triggers that Deb Dana talks about, this can really help them feel like they have a sense of control over their own reactions, and it can help them understand what's happening and why some of these reactions may be so strong. In phase 2 of my intergenerational trauma program, we go through very in-depth the cycle of neuroception, and we look at neuroception broken down in very distinct parts. And if you take these blocks and kind of shift them or work on them, it'll kind of shift the neuroception so that you have either more accurate neuroception, or neuroception isn't getting amplified to be faulty neuroception, and it's not getting dampened just to kind of shut down and in that collapsed state. Additional interventions are when the client is ready and has that safety and stabilization pretty squared away. You can do EMDR and brain spotting. You can also use these to establish some of that safety and resourcing. But those require very solid training, especially with people with complex trauma. And then parts work. There's internal family systems, which I'm not trained in, but they talk about different parts of the person that kind of come out at different times. The way that I look at parts is through structural dissociation, and that kind of takes reactions and those dissociated or kind of parts that everybody has and puts them in categories of animal instinct. So it's your fight, flight, freeze, submission. There's a cry for help, or attach or cling for survival. So that's your attachment drive. And you look at how these parts are interacting and influencing each other and see if you can kind of tweak how they're interacting to make the outcome different, because there's certain patterns that these kind of follow. That could be a whole year's training in and of itself. So let's look at ethical considerations and boundaries that are important with complex trauma clients. Um, so unique to intergenerational trauma and um, the complex trauma in adults, we're dealing with that relational impact, and we want to be really sure and clear about the relationship. So we want clear, informed consent and discussion of the therapy interventions. And we may need to review this at various times and kind of come back to it and explain kind of how this fits in, or explain the therapy interventions, and make sure that those things are very, very clear so that they feel like they have some predictability in the therapy relationship and activities, but also so that you build trust with them. Limits of confidentiality are also really important to make very clear because of the degree of crises some clients have and the difficulties that they experience that make it where we're in a position where we may have to breach confidentiality for their safety or even someone else's. So this is really important because of their relational hurts in the past and ruptures. So they have to know very clearly the line that we may have to cross when there's something reported if we can't establish their safety and their suicidal thoughts. So it doesn't come as much of a surprise. And if it does happen, they're more likely to re-engage with that same therapist and try to work through that relational rupture, which if they can do it in that circumstance, that's an extremely powerful experience for them. In therapy boundaries, what you may find is if you were on a deserted island, had no water, and all of a sudden somebody comes and gives you something to drink, something to eat, and comforts you, you're going to want more of that. And that's a normal experience for people who have never had a relationship that they feel like they can trust and that they can really be themselves, and they start to experience healing. So they may have some relational confusion. I was thinking about you the other day and I bought something for you, which we can't really accept. And so they may feel compelled to seek more contact or closer contact. So it's a balance between those relational needs and kind of crisis. So sometimes crisis can get wrapped into that, and there's frequent crises because they need to feel like you're close to them. So it's very important, and it's too long to fully explore in this episode, but that's a really important part, is those relational boundaries. And it's not at all because they're trying to do something malicious or they're intentionally crossing boundaries. They've found relief and they're open to that and they want more, but because this is a therapy relationship, we have to follow those ethics. The other area that's extremely important under ethics is having cultural competency. So we have to understand intergenerational history of that population or that location or geographical area, their culture, their background. We want to know that about the community. If there was a big major disaster in that community, that's going to impact the experience of developmental and complex trauma. And we also want to be able to tap into cultural and spiritual beliefs that are resources of strength or resilience factors. So those are really important to be able to get in there and find those examples of resilience through their generational history. So now we're going to look at resilience. And resilience has gotten kind of a bad rap since the pandemic. Everybody was kind of under pressure that wasn't expected, and it was pretty intense with huge implications. So, resilience kind of became a triggering word during the pandemic and still kind of is. So, it's really important to look at different types of resilience and make sure when you're talking about resilience, they understand which type you're talking about. So You want to distinguish between three types: general resilience, autonomic resilience, and adversity-based resilience. So, well, general resilience are those kind of personality traits or characteristics or resources that a person has that helps you kind of bounce back after a difficult experience. That's just general resilience. And people who have had complex or developmental trauma, they don't feel like they have any resilience because they've had so many things happen that there's no bouncing back. That's a transformative experience. So it kind of negates the depth of the experience with complex and developmental trauma if we just kind of talk about bouncing back. And I think that's where the triggering point is for most people. So, adversity based resilience, this is a concept that I talk about with most of my clients. It's about survival, and they survived it, but they're exhausted. They put everything into surviving that they didn't have the time to have fun experiences and feel like they're a good person that can influence the world, but they survived. So they're exhausted. But if other people were put in the situation that some of the clients that we have experienced, they wouldn't make it. So the fact that they got through the experiences that they had earlier in life and they made it, it's that is adversity based resilience, and they should be commended for that. And that can be a huge shift for them in some of those feelings of shame and worthlessness and all those deeper impacts on the beliefs about the self. So, autonomic resilience is what we want to help them develop. So, this is having kind of a wide window of tolerance. There's more options to get into that window of tolerance. There's more space that people can kind of tolerate difficult circumstances without having a full hyperarousal or hypoarousal reaction. And they can return to a regulated state much easier after they have been pulled out of that window of tolerance. So another thing about the window of tolerance, sometimes people get triggered by that like, why are we trying to teach people to tolerate things? It's a stress based, we all have stress in our lives, and it's kind of the capacity to manage and handle stress. It's not that we want them to just sit there and tolerate whatever's going on. We also autonomic resilience. So it's the wide window of tolerance. It's also accurate neuroception. So we want them to accurately detect threat and danger so that they can respond. We don't want to take those away because they're adaptive and we need them for survival. We just want them to be accurate. And we want them to have a high degree of awareness and strategies or skills for self-regulation. A lot of that's going to come through co-regulation, but we want them to develop those skills and strategies so that when they come out of their window of tolerance and they are either hyper-aroused or hypo-aroused, they recognize it and they have some strategies of how they can get back into a regulated state, because that gives them a huge sense of control, which the epitome of trauma is a loss of control that is deeply impactful. So, our role in fostering resilience in clients is supporting their neurobiology and developing that autonomic resilience. It's the co regulation in therapy that's the foundation for self regulation, and something that they probably have not had very much of or have had bad experiences with in relationships that kind of blocks their ability to experience co regulation. And we want to identify their survival skills, their behavioral and attachment adaptations. We want to look at those as they were adaptive at that time. They helped you survive, they helped you get through that experience, but now they're not useful anymore. So if you had a client that was in a violent home or in a violent neighborhood, and the child gets really kind of verbally aggressive, physically aggressive, that's a survival skill in that environment. But as they grow up, if they have their own kids or family and there's not those threats continuing, if they continue those skills, they're no longer useful, and they need to shift those skills. So this also helps them get away from some of that worthlessness and the emotional and self-belief impacts of complex trauma, because they can see that they needed those skills to survive, but they need to develop other ones because they're just not useful. So, specific techniques and strategies, again, going back to the polyvagal ladder, which was, I think, first designed by Deb Dana. She talks about triggers, glimmers, and anchors. So, what are things, the triggers are what are things that take you out of a regulated state. Glimmers are what kind of brings you back to a regulated state. And anchors are kind of what helps you stay in that regulated state when you're in some type of stressful situation. I also like to work with the cycle of neuroception that I mentioned before. So there's a process of each time we go through an event where neuroception is triggered very strongly, it either amplifies the neuroception or it dampens it. So we become more sensitive and more reactive because there's really big threats out there, or we kind of it almost like it gets broken and there's a dampening and kind of a non-reactivity. So that's maybe like a in a prison setting where there's a murder and people are, yeah, like, yeah, it just kind of happens every day, no big deal. That's kind of dampened neuroception, but they need it in that environment. So when it's no longer helpful or useful, it can cause faulty neuroception or kind of a lack of neuroception. So we want to look at those 6 stages, which are first the neuroception, any sensations that come related to that sense of danger or threat, and looking at the autonomic state, their emotional reaction, behavioral reaction, and the story that they create for themselves or how they understand that experience. And that's that state to story transformation that we can help them go through. And this is really helpful for people with complex trauma. So, those are the 6 areas that we planned on discussing today. So, we've talked about identifying complex trauma and distinguishing it from other types of trauma. We looked at key considerations of clients who have complex trauma and assessment tools. We looked at interventions and ethical considerations, and how we can nurture resilience in our clients. So, I hope you can use this information to look at your approach to complex trauma and maybe areas that you need to develop additional skills or experience with. So I'm wondering, what small shifts can you make to elevate your practice with complex trauma clients? Um, so these cases, we have to remember, they can be very challenging, and we're human. So sometimes we can get pretty overwhelmed with them, but we have to remember that these are clients, they're not challenging us purposefully, it's not willful behavior. They have deep wounds and a lot of distrust, and we are responsible for helping create a new experience of relationships and a foundation for healing. So, if you're interested in the Intergenerational Trauma Therapist Immersion Calendar for 2024, you can go to calendar.barbarawoodspphd.com and you can get your own copy there. And let's see. So, next week, we're going to talk about developmental trauma in kids. And we're going to just kind of do a surface overview of that to prepare and get our foundation of intergenerational trauma. So, I hope you have a good day, and I will talk with you later.